Today we celebrate the greatest story ever told. And what I believe is the only story that actually makes sense of the world. So before we tell this story, and I'm going to tell it for us today, I want you to think about the story that you're living. We all live a story. We all have a story that informs how we understand the world. Maybe you don't think about it. Maybe it's the furthest thing from your mind. But it doesn't mean that it's not the script that's guiding your life. Who are the main characters of that story? What is the setting? And it doesn't matter what story you find yourself a part of. We all have a couple of questions that we have to deal with. Questions like, why do we exist? What is our purpose? What is good? What is not good, or what is evil? How do we know what is good, and how do we know what is not good or what is evil? Why is there even evil in the world? And then the ultimate problem that we all deal with is our ultimate end that we all face, and that's death. We can't escape that reality. So no matter what world we live in, and no matter what story we're telling, we have to think about these questions. Is life really just about trying to fight, to survive, and maybe to thrive, only to die? Is that really what life is about? Because a lot of us and a lot of our culture lives that way. How can we make life as good as possible? Because this is all we've got. And we all know death's coming. Is this really the story that explains the world? So today I want you to think about these questions. I want you to think about the story that you're living. And I'm going to tell you the story I think is a story that's the best story ever told, and the story that makes the most sense of the world. And like every good story, it has a beginning. So let's look at that beginning today. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In this story, the beginning is God. That is the first character in the story. Not us, God. We are the first. We're not the first characters. God is. And the setting is heaven and earth. Heaven is where God is at. And then the earth is everything else. So this is the place in the setting. Now, if we were to keep reading the Genesis, which we're not going to read all of it, we would see that God made all things in the world. And then we learn about the pinnacle of his creation, humans. And this is what he says about humans in verse 27 of Genesis 1. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So now we have more characters in the story. But we have to go all the way to the end of the first chapter. This is when we come into the picture. So from the beginning, we see that we aren't the main characters of this story. At best, we're maybe a sidekick. We're Robin to Batman. We're Ron and Hermione to Harry. We're Luke and Leia, or Han and Leia to Luke maybe. Now I know some of those stories are multiple main characters, but it's not that way in our story. God made us in his image to be his partners, but our purpose is connected to being connected to God because it's his story and we're a part of it. So this is how the story starts. We're not at the center. So that means if we're living a story where we're at the center, our story is wrong, even if just slightly. And what that means is that we're going to be off the mark when it comes to fulfilling our life and living a life that we were made to live. Because God wanted us to partner with him. He wanted to make a world that was in harmony with him, where we were living in his desires and his will. And God had this to say about the world that he made. Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he made, and it was very good. Now, what this means is it had order and purpose, and that order and purpose brought harmony. So this is the world that God made. This is a story that we're all supposed to be living. So the question is, if that's the story we're supposed to be living, well, why isn't that what we experience? Now, maybe your story doesn't have anything to do with a world that started off in order, with order and purpose and harmony. Maybe you're okay with a world that started in chaos, but you have to ask the question, well then why should we expect it to be anything other than that? And why is it that we want it to be better? So when we continue the story, and we're not going to read chapter 3 of Genesis, but if you wanted to go to chapter 3, that's where you'd hear the story of why it is that the world broke down. But the story breaks down because of us, because of humans. Because we decide we're not going to be a part of God's program anymore. We're not going to join and be a part of his partnership. Instead, we're going to go in our own direction. So what this is like is we say, okay, you know what, we're going to take a shoe, and we're going to try to use it to drive in a nail. Or maybe even something worse, we're going to try to use a banana. I mean, bananas and shoes weren't made to drive in nails. Or another analogy, it's like we're an actor or an actress in a play or a movie, and we're off script. We're not following the direction of the director. We're going to make our own story and follow our own direction. That's what's wrong with the world. We are off on our own. We've gone off the plan. And that's made the world and everything around us go off the rails. And the story takes a turn for the worst. So this explains why the world is the way it is. It explains disasters, disease, sickness, depression, addiction, anything you can put in there. It's because of human rebellion, or what we call sin. But the story doesn't end here. Because remember, this is the greatest story ever told. And even though the story starts good and it takes a turn for the worst, God says, I am not going to abandon my people. Look at this passage from Isaiah again, 25, 7 and 8. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. This passage, written a long time ago, talks about the moment when God would do away with death forever. Because death is the ultimate sign of chaos in the world. Sin leads to destruction. Destruction leads to death. We have brought chaos into God's good world. We have brought evil instead of God's goodness. But God says, I'm not going to abandon my people. I am going to do away with death. And so God sets out to do that. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns in the story, and we're not going to tell all of it today. But that story gets to Jesus. And Jesus comes and he says, I am God's chosen one. I have come to make the world whole again. And what does he do? He starts to take the signs of death and evil, and he does away with them. He heals the sick. He casts out demons. He brings people back to life who have died. He restores their life. And they're able to live. They will die again, but they're able to live longer. Signs that God is doing away with the powers of death and sin forever. And that's what Jesus says. He's like, I came to do this until the horrible happens. Jesus is arrested and he's executed by the Romans. And it seems as if all is lost. Until we turn to our gospel reading from John chapter 20, verse 1 today. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So Mary Magdalene is one of Jesus' followers. You might have heard of the 12 disciples if you've been remotely connected to church. She's not one of the 12, but she's one of the other disciples further out that is following Jesus around. He talks about having 72 at one point. He always has a crowd with him. She's a close follower. And Jesus is executed on a Friday. Saturday is Sabbath for the Jewish people, so they stay home. They don't go out. Sunday is the first day of the week. She goes back to the tomb, and she finds the tomb open. So this is what she does. Verse 2, so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So Mary doesn't even look in the tomb. She runs to find Simon and another disciple who's not named. We believe that disciple is John, the author of the gospel, but we don't know for sure. So Mary comes and finds these two guys, and she says, Jesus, we think his body's been taken. So this is what these guys do. Verse 3. So Peter and the other disciples start for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, and as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. So Peter and the other disciple arrive at the tomb. Now, the unnamed disciple arrives first. He looks in and he sees the burial cloth laying there. Then Peter comes and he goes all the way in. He sees the burial cloth and he sees the cloth they would wrap around the head. It's still folded up and they're both in the same position, as if the body just left them there. And then the other disciple finally comes in and he looks and it says that he believed. And that's all we're told. Then they leave. So we have an empty tomb and we have grave clothes that are left, but we have no body. So where's the body? Verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So Mary carries the best news ever told. She's seen Jesus. He's alive. Mary takes the good news. At this point, we need to step outside the story. Because remember, the greatest story ever told, the problem is death. Death is the problem that needs solved. And Jesus comes and says he's going to do away with death and evil. And he starts to do it, but then he's executed. And he goes into death. But death can't hold him, because he's risen and resurrected out of the death. And he's brought into life. The greatest story ever told has an answer for death, and that answer is Jesus. And here's the good news. That's not just a message for Jesus, it's a message for us. It's a message for the whole world. We find victory over death in Jesus. What story are you living? And how do you think about death? Death is the thing that humans have been most scared of and most fascinated with for generations. The good news of the Easter story is that we find victory over death in Jesus. But how do we find this victory? How is it that we find this victory? How do we find this story and make it our own? Because that's what the invitation is today, to make this story our story. Well, this is what Peter says in that passage from Acts again, 10:43. All the prophets testify about him that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Now I'm going to translate that for us. We find victory over death in Jesus if we believe the greatest story ever told. It's not just about sin. So much we hear about sin, and sin is a problem. But the real problem is death. And death is caused by sin. And Jesus came to defeat death. We find victory over death in Jesus. So this is the question for all of you today. What story are you living? And how does your story handle death? How does your story handle the meaning of life and what it means to flourish and to be fully human and to enjoy the world that we've been given? Because remember, God made us to partner with him in overseeing creation, which means when we do things like create, when we do things like garden, when we make beautiful music and beautiful art, when we do things like cultivate the earth, we are helping creation flourish. And that's what God made us to do. He says, I want you to be my partners in bringing harmony and beauty in the world. And instead we said, you know what, God, we want to do that too, but we want to do it on our own. And we do a pretty good job. But when we go to the deepest parts of our hearts, in human society, what do we see? Evil and death. Because that's all we ever bring. But we find victory over death in Jesus. So do you believe the story? The greatest story ever told. Do you believe that God made the world good and that we're the ones that have messed it up? Do you believe that Jesus came to make things right? That he came to offer himself as a sacrifice, but to be resurrected from the dead? Because if you do, you can find freedom from death. Because we find victory over death in Jesus. This is the greatest story ever told. That God wanted us to be his partners in a good world. That he wanted us to bring harmony to the world. But instead, we brought chaos and destruction. But we don't have to bring that anymore. We can partner with God again and make the world whole. This is why the story of Jesus isn't just something for the future. It's not just something about getting to heaven and having your soul saved. No, God wants to bring heaven to earth. Remember, those are the two parts of the story. His realm and our realm, heaven and earth. He wants to bring those two together. And he wants to be here with us in a world that is whole again, where there's no longer death. And that is what he invites us into. And that is the story that I invite you to be a part of today. The greatest story ever told. We find victory over death in Jesus. So what story do you live by? I believe there's only one story that makes sense of the world. And it's the story that has Jesus at the center. And what do we find when we look at that center? We find victory over death. So if you have been gone for a while, it's never too late to make the story center. And when you make the story center, it means you're no longer the center of the story. If you've never been a part of the story, it's never too late to start. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. If you're not sure, every week we tell this story in one way or another. Every week we live this story. Here in a couple minutes, we're going to live a meal that reminds us of this story. This is the life that we're called to. And as a congregation here at Salem Magley Church, what we want to do is we want to seek harmony, not just with ourselves, but in the world. That's what we want to be about, bringing that harmony back to a world that's broken. Because we find victory over death in Jesus.